All right, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this virtual public meeting for the Union County Critical Intersection Program. Phase 2 of this program includes 5 separate intersections, and we're hosting separate meetings for each intersection. And tonight we're going to focus on the NC 200 Plyler Mill Rd intersection in unincorporated Union County. And we're going to start with a brief presentation that'll take about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a question and answer session. And before we jump in, Allison, if you can jump to the next slide. I just want to take a quick minute to introduce the panelists that we have for tonight's meeting. My name is Jenny Noonkester with RS&H, and I'm a senior planner on the consulting team assisting Union County with this project. And next we have Bjorn Hansen with Union County, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to learn more about this intersection and the proposed designs that we're evaluating for potential funding in the future to improve traffic and safety in this part of Union County. So thank you.
All right, and next we have Stuart Basham with NCDOT.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Stuart Basham. I'm with NCDOT's Division 10 office. I'm the Division Planning Engineer for Division 10. I handle prioritization and funding of projects, and I'm heavily involved with the critical intersection analysis.
Thank you, Stuart. And lastly, we have Allison with RS&H.
Hi, I'm Allison Drake with RS&H, and I am the consultant project manager assisting the county with this project.
Thank you. And now I'm just going to take a minute to walk through some of the webinar logistics. For those of you that are attending the meeting, you won't be able to share your video or your audio, so you'll need to submit any questions or comments that you have through the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. You can type any questions that you have there at any point during the meeting, and then we'll answer them when we get to the Q&A portion after the presentation. We are making a recording of this meeting, and we'll post it on the project website for anyone that's unable to attend tonight. And lastly, I'll just remind our panelists to please keep their microphones muted when you're not speaking so we can minimize any background noise. Next slide, Allison. Here's a quick overview of tonight's presentation. We'll start with some background information on the critical intersection program. Then we'll show you the intersections that are included in phase 2 and talk about the steps in the study process. And then we'll switch over to the online website for the NC 200 Plyler Mill Rd intersection and talk through the specific design concepts being considered and the next steps for that intersection. And then after that presentation, we'll start our Q&A session. So just a reminder that you can type your questions at any point during the presentation. And with that, I will hand it over to Bjorn, who'll give us some background information on the critical intersection program.
Thank you, Jennifer. So looking at this slide, starting in 2014, Union County identified a need to focus its efforts on intersection projects throughout the county. We're a large county with multiple municipalities, and we were getting really distracted by figuring out where to focus our efforts. So with the assistance of the Charlotte Regional Transportation Planning Organization, we conducted a study looking at intersections throughout Union County for a combination of congestion and safety concerns. 15 intersections were identified with some preliminary designs and cost estimates that were associated with them. And the county, the municipalities, and the NCDOT used those as guidance to get funding to implement them. And over the next several years, 2/3 of those intersections were actually funded for implementation. And in 2018, 2019, Union County realized that it needed to refresh its list, come up with new priority intersections, and it did so. We did the work in-house to identify the locations. We went out to the public for input. We identified a prioritization process, how much to weight specific concerns. Hearing from the public, we actually weighted safety as our #1 criteria, and identified 15 intersections throughout the county, and you're going to see those locations on a next slide. We then received 2 separate grants from the Charlotte Regional Transportation Planning Organizations to do the analysis of them and figure out, well, what's the design that should be selected for those locations and how much will it cost? And then use that information to go get funding based off of that design and work. So last year, we completed analysis on 6 intersections, And then we received the second grant, which we're now using for 5 additional intersections. Next slide, please. So looking throughout the county, there you see the 15, and the ones in gray were conducted last year under phase 1. And several of them have actually been funded through DOT or Charlotte Regional Transportation Planning Organization funding programs. We're now in these blue list of intersections, which are throughout the county, and this is the first one of our outreach efforts, which is 200 and Plyler Mill Road. The other 4 will be conducted over the next couple weeks. Next slide. And now I will turn it over to Allison, who will review the actual process that we're undertaking to come up with recommendations for these specific intersections. Thank you.
Thank you, Bjorn. In setting these intersections, Union County and its municipalities formed an advisory committee. Based on data gathered and analysis results, 2 alternatives were developed for each intersection. We are now in the public involvement stage where we are engaging the public for feedback through virtual meetings as well as the online survey. These results will be used to select a preferred alternative for each intersection. Cost estimates and recommendations will then be compiled into a final report, which will be used to give municipalities a leg up to compete for funding for these projects. The final report will be posted on a Union County website upon completion. We will now show the website that is publicly available to discuss the intersection in more detail. The NC 200 and Plyler Mill Road intersection is located in an unincorporated part of Union County, and it is currently a 3-legged intersection with a stop sign on the Plyler Mill Road approach only. Review of the crash history in this location showed that a large portion of the accidents were rear-end crashes on southbound NC 200. This is likely from vehicles that are stopped to turn left onto Plyler Mill Road. 2 alternatives were developed. Alternative 1 consists of turn lane improvements, and alternative 2 is a single-lane roundabout. Alternative 1 addresses this safety concern with the addition of an exclusive left turn lane on southbound NC 200. There's an existing large box culvert under NC 200 that would need to be lengthened to accommodate the widening of the road for the left turn lane. You can also see guardrail here that would also be added to protect vehicles traveling over the culvert. This alternative also realigns Plyler Mill Road to improve the intersection approach angle. It also adds an exclusive right turn lane on Plyler Mill Road. This alternative allows full access to remain to all the properties surrounding the intersection. However, some right-of-way acquisition would be required. NCDOT has a standard process for right-of-way acquisition, but this is not happening at this time as this project is not yet funded. Alternative 1 potentially reduces crashes by 44% and reduces peak hour vehicle delays, which are basically traffic delays during the busiest hour of the day, by 64%. The approximate cost of this alternative is $1,850,000. These costs include construction, right-of-way, engineering and design, and construction inspection. The cost is in 2020 dollars, so they could go up with inflation before the project is actually funded. However, since we're really early in the design process, there are a lot of contingencies included in this cost, so there's actually a chance the cost could go down when it's actually constructed. Alternative 2 is a single-lane roundabout that addresses safety and traffic delays. Similar to Alternative 1, Plyler Mill Road is realigned to improve the intersection approach angle. Access to all properties surrounding the intersection is maintained, including a 4th leg of the roundabout, right here, to accommodate the driveway to multiple residences. This leg will be smaller and not have concrete islands to help prevent vehicles from accidentally exiting the roundabout onto the driveway. Similar to Alternative 1, this alternative would also require some right-of-way acquisition. This alternative potentially reduces crashes by 50% and reduces peak hour vehicle delays by 37%. The approximate cost of this alternative is $2,430,000. If you want to come back to review this information later, you can click on the information circles as shown on your screen. There's also a survey at the bottom of the page that you were able to provide feedback until April 2nd. The next step for the critical intersection analysis is to evaluate the feedback received from the public involvement and select a preferred alternative for each intersection. The design concepts will then be finalized and presented to their corresponding municipal boards for approval. Finally, a study workbook and action plan will be completed for all of the intersections. With the information provided by the workbook, the county can consider potential funding sources and apply for funding. I will now pass it back to Jenny to conduct the Q&A portion of this meeting.
Great, thank you, Allison. Again, I'll just remind everyone to please submit any of your questions using the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. You can also search online for the Union County Critical Intersection Program, and where you can find a link to the project website that Allison was just showing, and also review information for any of the other 4 intersections. So we encourage you to go online and review the information, and also complete a survey that will tell you which alternative you prefer for this intersection. And we are accepting that feedback through April 2nd. You can also submit questions and comments using that online survey. So if you think of any questions after this meeting, please go ahead and submit those through the website. And we also have Bjorn's contact information shown on the screen, so you can reach out to him with any questions you have about this specific intersection or the critical intersection program in general. And right now I'm going to go ahead and open a poll within the meeting. And that'll just let you, if you'd like to just provide your feedback that way, if you have an option, if you prefer alternative 1, which is the turn lane improvements, or option 2, that was the roundabout, you can provide that feedback to us during this meeting. And I'll just leave that open for the remainder of the Q&A portion if you wanted to fill that in. And with that, we can start taking questions. I don't see a lot that are coming through on the box yet, so I'll leave that open if anybody comes up with any. And maybe, Bjorn, we can just start with some of the more common questions that we've been getting, if you want to talk a little bit about, when we could potentially see the construction of these improvements.
Well, the process for getting anything built on a DOT facility is not something that happens in a matter of days or weeks. The first step would be to complete the design, and that's something that we hope to have complete by June. That would allow us to then apply for funding solicitations either through the DOT or through the Charlotte Regional Transportation Planning Organization. That occurs a couple times a year. And so if we were to apply this fall, we might get funding in the summer of 2022. You're then talking about realistically a minimum of 2 to 3 years to build anything. You have the design, the right-of-way acquisition, utility relocation, and then the actual construction. So, if you're talking about either the turn lane or the roundabout project, it would be at least 3 to 4 years for something to be delivered, which sounds like a long time, but unfortunately, following the steps for use of federal funds, which these would be, requires a lot of checks and inspections in order to ensure that the appropriate steps are followed. And Stuart is with the DOT here and can provide any additional information, very experienced on project delivery.
Sure, thank you, Bjorn. As Bjorn noted, there are a couple of different sources for funding small intersection projects such as this. Depending on which funding source we use, that can definitely feed directly into the amount of time involved, both to secure funding for a project and to get it through design and right away and ultimately to construction.
All right, thank you. And we have had a question come through on the Q&A box. And the question is with regard to speed strips that may be used with the roundabout alternative. That they tend to be noisy, which is a concern of some residents in the area. So would there be any plans for speed strips to be used with that alternative? And Stuart, that may be a good question for you.
Sure, most likely not. Generally, we do speed strips along, or rumble strips, as we call them, along our US routes, higher speed facilities. In an area where we were looking at an intersection improvement such as this one, the speeds The issue is somewhat controlled by the fact that you have a roundabout there in of itself. So speed strips or rumble strips is probably not something that we would use in the vicinity of this project.
All right, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A box right now. Looks like we've gotten some responses on the poll. 2 votes for the roundabout alternative and 1 for the turn lane improvements, and then 1 for neither option. And Bjorn, I don't know, I know you've gotten a few calls about some of these projects over the past week or so. I don't know if there's any other kind of general questions that you might want to answer for the group. And looks like we have one more comment that's coming in. So maybe while you're doing that, Bjorn, we'll get some more comments in the box.
Sure. So we have received some comments in the past week. So we know that social media and press releases are working to get the word out to people. And some people are asking about, well, have you thought about a certain intersection or a certain location, or why aren't you focusing on repaving a certain road instead of trying to spend all this money on an intersection upgrade? And the answer is that there are already probably 24 intersections that are funded throughout the county for various types of improvements. Might be 4-way stop signs, or it might be a roundabout or other type of physical change to the intersection. On some intersections, particularly on NC 16 north of Waxhaw, people would say, well, why didn't you focus on this intersection? The answer was kind of like what we talked about for the length of actually delivering an intersection project. NC 16 is funded for widening. We would love for it to be under construction right now, but it will be under construction in a handful of years. And if we were to focus on an intersection project on that corridor, it would probably be built and then torn up soon after. And with the limited amount of funds we have available to help get these projects delivered, we wanted to focus on intersections where we were pretty confident that those benefits were going to accrue over many years, because the road wasn't going to get widened, and 200 is not going to get widened for quite a long time. So that's why this intersection made it on, and perhaps one on Providence Road did not. And now I see that we have another question. So I'll turn it back to you, Jenny.
Yes, okay, thank you. And Allison, this one was asking if we considered a 3-way stop. So I don't know if you want to go back to the story map or pull up.
Yes, I can do that.
Section, thanks.
Right, so as we were developing these alternatives, we did meet as an advisory committee. So that advisory committee that I spoke about earlier is made up of Union County, local municipalities, NCDOT, CRTPO, and then on our team as well, we also have our traffic engineer who analyzed each of these intersections and helped us come to the conclusion of 2 alternatives. And so through that analysis, the 2 that we found that would provide the most improvement would be the 2 options that we have shown. Really, that adding that left turn lane on southbound 200 is really helping to address what we were seeing there, as I mentioned, with the crash history. I don't know if Bjorn or Stuart, if you guys want to add to that.
I'll just say that we have seen more all-way stops on intersections, and I think the previous thoughts about them were that they were kind of interim solutions. I'm thinking of a couple on Newtown Road that were implemented just because the traffic or the crashes were so high, but they were in the short term, and they were going to be replaced by a construction project to upgrade those intersections for the longer term. But the all-way stops have worked. But I think in this instance, it was a combination of speed and the sight distance that made it where that might actually be a negative. So I'll hand it over to Stuart to talk about all-way stops and where they might work and where they might not work.
Sure. Thank you, Bjorn. Generally, we've spent a lot of time looking at all-way stops, and we've received a lot of guidance on that recently from our traffic mobility and safety unit. And generally, about 7,500 vehicles per day on a roadway is about the upper limit for an always stop. So they'll function effectively up to about 7,000, 7,500. And when you get above that point or near that point or above it in terms of volume, then you need to, the recommendation is to begin evaluating other intersection treatments.
Thank you, Stuart. And it looks like, and you may be able to help with this next question as well. It says that the speed on Lancaster Highway tends to be excessive, and they're wondering if that could be addressed in the future, and noting that back by some of the gas stations at Lancaster and MLK Boulevard, that the speed limit is 45 miles an hour, and wondering if that, you know, lower speed could be extended down the road instead of having the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit.
I'm gonna have to hand it off to Stuart about enforcement of speed limits and posting of new speed limits.
Sure. So generally, as Bjorn noted, speed limit is somewhat of an enforcement issue, and has been for many years. We get lots of complaints about speeding and motorists not observing the speed limits. Occasionally, we do get requests to lower speed limits along certain roadways. That involves a speed study to see how fast motorists are actually traveling. It involves looking at a 5-year crash history of the accidents that have occurred in that corridor, and whether or not, from a practical standpoint, we feel that lowering the speed limit or putting in some type of speed reducing devices can help with both travel speed and accident reduction. And that's generally handled by our division traffic engineer for NCDOT's Division 10 office in this area.
And I would just note that the overriding theme in hard decisions like this is about trade-offs. There's no clear answers. All the easy decisions have been made previously, and all we're left now are the tough ones. So there are pluses and minuses, and the county commissioners and with the concurrence of the DOT are going to, you know, choose a design that is feasible and is supported, and that is going to be a combination of trade-offs. You know, there's going to be some access and purchase of right-of-way that comes into play here in other areas. Like, for example, in a future meeting, we'll have one for NC 75 and Potter and downtown Mineral Springs that has some significant impacts on adjacent property owners. That'll be a big trade-off that has to be made. Do you want more benefits with more impacts, or do you want less impacts with potentially less benefits? And this one will have impacts as well, and we have to consider those in the decision that also ultimately gets made in terms of which design to try and implement.
And it looks like we've gotten just one more of a comment in the Q&A box, just saying that the turn lane alternative looks to be a little less intrusive overall, that the roundabout would actually have a little bit larger of a footprint than the turn lane option. Allison, I don't know if you want to look a little bit about kind of showing the footprint for each.
Right, and this one is kind of unique in that a turn lane, generally adding a turn lane would be definitely on the less expensive and less intrusive side. However, as I mentioned, there is this large box culvert, and one advantage of the roundabout is that the limits of that, because you don't need all the lanes coming in, is that we were able to tie that back in before the culvert. So the impacts are certainly different for each one. With the roundabout, you're going to see more impacts right at the intersection. Of course, it has the larger intersection footprint. But then with the turn lanes, you're going to see maybe a little bit narrower of a footprint, but it extends a little bit further on the legs.
Yeah, and 200 is a unsafe corridor. The state had an emphasis on it and did an overall corridor analysis in the last 2 or 3 years. And since then, there have been, I think, at least 3 funded roundabouts. A couple have been completed. There's at least one more that is forthcoming at Rocky River and Parkwood School. That'll be a large well, maybe it'll be a 5-lane roundabout, but it'll be a large roundabout project. And that's due to a combination of speed, moderate volumes, and access issues. You have a lot of turning movements. The side streets, sometimes you just get hypnotized by, what's coming and going, and you don't even see the vehicle that's about to T-bone you. And that's why these roundabouts are happening more and more common because they are very safe. Any kind of crashes that do occur are glancing hits. They aren't these catastrophic T-bones or head-ons. And that's a consideration here. There's the congestion, but there's also the safety benefits.
And then looks like we've gotten one more question about right-of-way. If the purchase of right-of-way, when will the county purchase the land for the road improvements? Like, do we know when the right-of-way would happen?
Sure. The county owns no roads, like every other county in North Carolina. So the fact that we're facilitating this is somewhat unique, but the county may contribute funds to a project, but we would not be the one that would administer this. It would almost certainly be the NCDOT, and so they would actually acquire the property. There's a very rote and specific process that they have to follow to acquire it, appraise it, give rights of appeals to that, negotiation. And since this is not a funded project, there is no schedule. But if it were funded today, it probably wouldn't go to right-of-way for 12 to 18 months. So that's kind of expectation management in terms of how long it would take for something to happen. So once it's announced, the public would probably find out about it informally, but in terms of the specific property owners, they would be notified specifically when there is an actual design and a specific understanding of how much property is required in order to deliver the project.
And maybe that's another good question, Bjorn, to just kind of talk a little bit about the process that would happen once the intersection is funded. I know you mentioned, 12 to 18 months to get to right away, but maybe just talk a little bit about the process that the project would go through at that point.
I'll hand it off to Stuart for that one, about the actual execution of a project.
Can you repeat that question, Jenny? I was reading a comment.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was just saying maybe we could talk a little bit about, once one of these projects is approved for funding, kind of what process it would go through from that point.
Sure. So the life cycle of a small intersection project such as this is determined first off by what year in which those funds are programmed. So depending on the funding source, those funds could come online relatively soon, or if it's funded through another source such as Charlotte Regional Transportation Planning Organization's funds, those funds are generally programmed out a few years in advance. And if that's the funding source for a project, then it may be a little bit of a period of time before we would actually get to a point where you would begin to see things happening on the ground. Once we move forward with a project, getting it into the workflow for our division design construct staff, they generally have a backlog of 12 to 18 months. We can insert it into their workflow, and when they get to it, they begin working on a project and get the design done. That generally can be done within 9 to 12 months, at which time the right-of-way phase could then be authorized. So generally, as Bjorn noted, once a project becomes funded and actually begins moving forward, it may be 2 to 3 years before you actually see any contact from right-of-way agents to acquire property, to construct a project, and things of that nature. Generally, with any right-of-way acquisition phase, the actual acquisition process takes some time, and generally that's a 6 to 12 month process at a minimum. If anyone needs to be relocated, that time can actually be longer because we need to allow additional time for those relocatees to find alternate housing and make arrangements to move. So that being said, we could be 3 to 4 years out total before we actually begin construction. And the construction period, generally for small projects like this, sometimes I've seen roundabouts constructed as quickly as 4 months. Other times I've seen them take 8 to 12 months. It depends on the complexity of the project and how much work has to be done on the approaches to tie the adjacent roads in to the roundabout.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question. It appears on the turn lane option that once those turn lanes are installed, it will become almost impossible to turn left onto Highway 200 from Plyler Mill Road. What will be done to help these drivers?
Yeah, Jenny, I can start with this one.
Okay.
So definitely on this alternative, there is a little bit of extra pavement. Now it would only be one extra lane that vehicles would have to cross. I know it's a little hard to tell that in the aerial view, but essentially really the main difference of lanes that you'd be crossing would just be that you'd have the lefts here that you would be looking back at. Now with this alternative, we do separate the right turn and left turns. The right turn is the heavier movement as people are turning to go into town, but there are some left turns, and the waiting time here would not be improved from this intersection for those lefts, other than that they'd be out of the way of the right turns going into town. That would be one difference for those vehicles. And the roundabout option would be that there would be more, maybe less traffic delays for them to turn left with the roundabout option. So definitely something to consider between the two alternatives. But Bjorn, feel free to add to that if you'd like.
I would say it's a little bit better in the fact that you have the left and right turn lanes from Plyler Mill, but it's a little bit more complicated because now you've got vehicles that are turning left and maybe vehicles that are masking vehicles that are going straight through, and that's an impact. That's part of the trade-off that has to be done. In terms of helping them, if it turns out that this was a poor decision, probably the retrofit would be installing a signal if that's warranted. But that's that hopefully that's incorporated into the analysis to determine what's the overall best decision to make in terms of the design.
Okay. And Allison, I don't know if you wanted, our next question has to do with the schedule. So I don't know if you want to flip back to the schedule graphic on the PowerPoint, but the question is, when will we know which plan, which alternative has been selected, and where can we find updates?
Sure, I'll take that one. So this goes to, this decision for this intersection would ultimately be made by the Board of County Commissioners because it's not in a municipality. And possibly in May, that decision would be made. And when that's done, that would be incorporated in with the decisions for all the other municipalities that are a part of this bundle of intersections. And we would do a social media post that the designs have been chosen for each individual intersection. The municipalities will probably post those decisions individually, but we would wait until we had the overall result and say that we've received the decisions for all of the intersections, and then the posting of the report, which would occur in June, which is really just the summary of all the individual decisions. So I would say by June that will be done. We have the county website for the critical intersection program where we post these reports, but we do a good job of posting decisions on social media as well for things that are of great interest to the public.
Yeah, those have all been really good questions. Thank you all for submitting those. I don't have any additional questions that have come in at this point, so we can probably wait and give it a couple more minutes to see if anyone else has anything to add, or Bjorn or Stuart, if there's anything else that you wanted to discuss while we wait a couple minutes. But
I just wanted to thank everyone again. I see that we have 9 attendees, and this is the first one. We really didn't know how many we would get. It's a new world with COVID and public outreach, but honestly, we think this was a good step forward in terms of allowing the public to conveniently participate in this process. You know, the normal way we would do this is hold it at a town hall or a church or some other type of meeting facility, and people would have to come out. We'd have lots of boards and answer questions from the public, and maybe one person would show up, maybe 100 people would show up. But we think this is a pretty reasonable way of being respectful of people's time. So we hope it was useful for you. Yeah, maybe give everyone another minute. If we don't get any other questions, we'll close down the meeting.
And Jenny, I think this would be a good opportunity to remind everyone to, if they want some time to think about it, that they can go to the website as I showed. I can pull that back up again. The survey is at the bottom of the page there. And so you can submit those all the way until April 2nd. So there is some time there. I'd also encourage to go to the main page, which you can access here from the return to home page. And there's information here about all 5 of the intersections that we mentioned in the presentation. And each of them has their own individual survey if you'd like to provide feedback.
I would like to note, if you look at the upper right corner of this page, there's the social media options, the Facebook icon, the Twitter one, and then the little hyperlink. Those are very easy ways to share it with your friends and colleagues. We want things like this to go viral. We want lots of comments, dozens at a minimum. So please share this. Bother your spouse or your neighbors, and maybe they'll respond as well. We definitely want as much feedback as possible, because if you live or drive through this intersection, you're the one who will have to live with the decision that gets made in terms of a roundabout or turn lane, or potentially neither. So we do want to hear from you.
And also just mention again that we are, recording this presentation. So if there are any of your neighbors or friends that weren't able to join tonight, we'll get those links posted on the websites that you're looking at here. We'll have links to the meetings posted there if anyone wants to go back and take a look at those later. And again, accepting those comments through April 2nd. So we really appreciate everyone's participation tonight, and thank you for getting us through our first virtual public meeting. I think it went off pretty well, and I really appreciate all the great comments and questions. So with that, Bjorn, I think we're ready to close it out if you are.
Great. All right. Good night, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.